So let's talk about NYC Local Law 902B, better known as COPA, or the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of information flying around. I want to bring you some context and some of my opinions straight from the sources. One, I want to explain what this law intends to do. Two, what owners and property are subject to enforcement. Three, what are some of the points that are up for debate and that really need further clarification. And four, what are some of the potential impacts of COPA on the real estate market, and more importantly, who is this going to affect and how? Now, before we jump in, I want to encourage you to do your own research on laws or initiatives like COPA. You could do them direct from the sources. Don't forget, please don't make your opinion based on headlines, on Instagram stories, on YouTubers. Okay, NYC does a pretty good job of making all the information and the laws available, and you can go online and research them at places like this. So this is the New York City Council website. On the press release section, this one was from December 31st. You could see it shows all the initiatives that were done towards the end of last year, and right down here under introduction of 902B, which is the COPA law. You can click on this and it takes you right to the legislar.council.nyc.gov, and you can see all of the documents, statements, the whole timeline of the whole procedure of the law. So definitely use this to check this out. So the first thing I want to take a look at is the fiscal impact statement. Okay, fiscal impact statement OMB. It opens up one of this. It gives a summary of the legislation here. So it says this legislation requires the Department of Housing and Preservation and Development, HPD, to create an annual certification process for nonprofits. Certified nonprofits would have a right of first opportunity to purchase certain buildings. This would apply to Class A multiple dwelling units with 4 or more units that fit one or more of the criteria related to violations, affordability, and/or foreclosure. HPD must annually report its costs to the city for administration of this legislation, including costs to finance the rehabilitation of properties purchased by qualified entities and operating costs. So this looks like they want to hire one person for about $115,000 a year and $55,000 a year in personal services are regarding printing and mailing of notices. Adding one person to HPD for this does not give me a lot of confidence. It seems like a big undertaking, and for them to just be adding one staff does not seem adequate. New York City and New York State are already a burden to deal with. If you own property, I mean, you have to get certified copies of documents and mail them and go to an office that's a dedicated office that's open. That's very inconvenient to travel to and is only open during like limited hours. New York City and New York State, I strongly believe, need to do better and expand their online offerings and services for their residents. The second thing that stands out to me is the cost of finance and rehab these properties. I think this is the big money-making force behind this bill. As we'll see coming up in the video, the properties that are subject to enforcement are mostly distressed properties and are going to need big cash infusions to make them viable purchases. And someone's going to get a hookup with the city for funding, and they're going to make a ton of money with this. So be interested to know more about that process. But yeah, I mean, like the city financing the rehab of the properties that are purchased by these qualified entities. So nonprofits are going to pick these up, and then rehab costs are going to come from the city, from the taxpayers. I don't love. So right off the bat, the city using taxpayer money to incentivize nonprofits to purchase low-income buildings, and they're going to pay for their rehab costs. The city could have offered money to landlords to rehab these properties. It's been a point since 2019. The rent stabilized apartments that are expensive to rehab and that bring nothing back for the owner, and all that cost was on the owner. The city could have gave money to rehab apartments directly to landlords. But helping landlords is not something voters are going to get behind. I think the city used this bill and using this initiative and really forcing private property to transfer into the hands of nonprofit entities that are beholden to the city could have been avoided. And they're really just platforming on this for low-income renters for votes. This is a problem that could get solved, and that could have been solved and could have been funded, it seems like, very simply by going direct to the landlords, but they're having to use this fact that we're going to have them transfer from private landlords to nonprofits to bolster their, voting positions and using it as a platforming stance. It's really unfair. So now I want to go back. We could take a look at item number 902B, the final. This is the introduction of the bill. Here you could really read through and lay out, it lays out the process. This is like as it was presented to the city council. This is what was passed, or what is, is being passed right now with COPA. The first page of the chapter is going to go through and give some definitions to the terms. Right off the bat, if you look at line number 9, bona fide offer to purchase. The term bona fide offer to purchase means an offer to purchase a property subject to this chapter, which is an offer made in writing in good faith and without fraud. Now, I have some huge questions about what constitutes a bona fide offer. What if a qualified nonprofit makes an order at 60, 50% below market rate? It's a legit offer. They're really intending to buy it, but they'll buy it at like a huge discount. Nowhere in this bill does it lay out how a qualified offer is identified, other than it's from an approved entity with the city that's a real offer to purchase a property, even if that offer is well below market. Now, we all know purchasers are trying to buy something for as little as possible. The owner's trying to get as much as possible. A deal needs to be made. This is a market. It's worked that way forever. It works. I don't know what they're going to do if someone offers well below market value. Is that constituted? Do we have to try to work out a deal with them within 6 months? Do they have the right to a first refusal and the right to match for a year after that? As we'll see later on in the bill, there's a lot that needs to be explained, or what we will find out with what constitutes a bona fide offer. No, line number 8 again, like the offer subject to match. Okay, and this means that a bona fide offer to purchase a covered property made by a bona fide purchaser other than the qualified entity within 1 year of the final date on which the owner of such covered property rejected a bona fide offer to purchase a covered property made by a qualified entity existing in the first right offer within 1 year of the expiration of the time for a contract of sale to be executed for an owner. Now that is a huge flag for me, not something that gets enough press. Even if we accepted and were okay with the owner having to make a notice of intent to sell, to wait 30 days for a qualified entity to make a bona fide offer. After they accepted the offer, give another 3 months to get into contract, giving time for that qualified entity to execute their terms of the contract. If that doesn't work and the owner does make it to market after all of that, and then they do get an offer from a private entity, the person that made, or the nonprofit that made the first qualifying offer, gets another year to match that deal. That to me is a huge handcuff, because it's going to be extremely difficult for anybody to make an offer on the open market knowing that somebody has an offer to match and they're going to have a year to back it up. It's really hard to underwrite or, get financing terms in place for a deal like this, because you're going to have to, wait for the city to tell you that it's okay for a sale to go through. You're going to have to, kind of project financing terms like in the future, and that's horrible. So it seems like this is handcuffed, that no one's really going to make it out of this if a nonprofit does make like a qualifying offer. I find that extremely unfair. So it breeze down through some of the other terms in the bill. Right of the first offer to purchase, right of first refusal, those are self-explanatory. Sale, right? What that means is a transfer in exchange for money of anything of economic value. Makes sense. Definition of a tax credit investor, which is something that we can cover in another video. Section 26852 is the applicability. So this are which properties are going to be covered and subject to these regulations. Okay. The first line is, this chapter shall apply to a property that has a Class A multiple dwelling, such as defined in section 27/2004, with 4 or more dwelling units. So that's pretty much every property that is not owner occupied that has 4 or more units in New York City. Within the first year effective of this date, the local law that added this section, that time that such covered property becomes subject to the requirements and subdivision of this section. So it's laid out also in the law that within a year of this passing into law, New York City will have to send notices out to every property that is covered by it. So that's that big mailing thing that they do need funding for. Like every year, they're going to send you a notice that says you are or are not subject to this. If you're considering a sale, you have to go through this process. Number 4A, participants that are in alternative enforcement programs set forth in section 272153. So if you don't know what the alternative enforcement program is, this is the AEP program. If they have if a building has a number of class B and C violations and they don't remedy them, so this is a building that, residents are making complaints about, hot water, infestations, health hazards, no smoke detectors, things like that, and they don't get fixed. If a resident does make a complaint, building sends out an inspector. They'll issue you a violation. If you don't remedy the violations, then you can be put into the alternative enforcement program, which is where the city assigns you a property manager who can schedule and make repairs and then bill you for those repairs. They'll issue you an order to correct. You have about 4 months to do that. After you do that, they'll send another inspector out to get out. There is a process of getting out of AEP, so you can get these corrected, but it's difficult. So the unfortunate thing about this is, I'll just give you some examples. I know some owners that are older, they're in their 70s, 80s. They may own one or two, like 4 or 5, 6 unit buildings. They came, they worked, they saved, they bought these in like the 80s or 90s, and they're getting to the age now where they can't maintain their buildings as much. I had one client whose spouse passed away, who used to do all of the administrative work, and he was kind of a handyman. But it got to the point where he couldn't do the work as much, and his wife got cancer and passed away, and she wasn't keeping up with the paperwork with the city. This caused a bunch of violations, things that weren't getting remedied, paperwork that wasn't getting filed, and he fell into a bad place with his property. He wanted to sell the property to get out of it because there was no way he was making it back. The cost to hire the labor would have added a significant cost that would have made the property not feasible financially for him. But, there's a lot of people like that have 1 or 2 properties that once they do get older, they can't take care of it like they used to. They get violations from the city. They don't know how to manage the online database and all the paperwork and regulations that are coming out regularly from New York City. And they want to get rid of their properties. And now this is going to make it hard for them to do so. Or they're going to have to take a loss, because I can't imagine these nonprofits are going to be paying top dollar or market rate for these specific buildings. Along here, properties that are subject to an REM foreclosure pursuant to Chapter 4 of Title 11. Properties where there's an order to correct an underlying condition. And again, these are orders to correct, plumbing, heat, safety issues, things that the city demands that you fix as a property owner for your residents. A building that has been denied a certification of non-harassment. That means when an apartment can exit rent stabilization, this building owner needs a certificate of non-harassment so they can then rent the apartment at free market. So if an owner has made an application to turn an apartment free market and take an apartment out of rent stabilization and it was denied, it looks like within 12 months of that application and they want to sell the building, they cannot. This is a big blow to a lot of people's plans. Some people made purchases of buildings thinking they could take it out of rent stabilization. They'll be able to raise the rent on certain units in their apartment to make their funding and financing and investment feasible. And if they have a building and then the rents can't be raised and then they can't sell the building, they can't get out of their plan that they're already taking a hit on, they're going to have to go through this process with a qualified entity. So that's not great. And the same thing we hear the next line, that is subject to an affordability restriction that is set to expire within 2 years. So this is the 421A tax abatement, right? So a property that has an expiring 421A to where the rents can be reset, and if that's going to be within 2 years from now or from the date that this bill goes into law, if that landlord would try to sell that property, it would be subject to this, where they have to go to a nonprofit. So they're really going to try to keep those 421A properties as low income. That's what the city wants to do. Again, that's a huge blow to anyone. People have made investment plans, right? Like a lot of the times our commercial investors are looking 3, 5, 7 years out. There's an exit strategy. So there's an exit plan right now on the table in the next 3 years for an expiring 421A property, whether it be a refinance or something like that, rent resets. They made a, right, they've been renting units at $900, $1,100, $1,200 a month, $1,300 a month. That market rate would be $2,500 to $3,000, and now they're not going to be able to achieve that. So again, that's it's extremely unfortunate and a big blow to current investors. And then any other criteria that the department establishes by rule that the department determines would be constitute with its subdivision. So that's not great. Basically, they could just make up another criteria and it's going to be subject to a rule for that. That doesn't seem very democratic, and that really needs to be clarified. And then the building that has an average of at least one open hazardous or immediately hazardous violation per the housing maintenance code. So again, those hazardous violations are, no water, no hot water, no heat, no cooking, no gas, no smoke detectors, unsafe doorways, windows, things like that. Like those constitute that affect the living condition. If you have an open violation on there, and then you want to sell the property, you're going to have to go through this process. And then it says this chapter shall not apply to a property that is a multiple dwelling unit with 5 or fewer units in which the owner of the multiple dwelling occupies the dwelling unit for permanent residence purposes. So owner-occupied multifamily properties, for the most part, are not going to qualify. So if you do live in a 4-family, 5-family, 3-family that you own, do not worry, this will not apply to you. I just realized I recorded that whole section without showing you the bills. So here it is again, just one more time. Participants in AEP subject to foreclosure, subject to correct an underlying condition, that has been denied a certificate of no harassment, subject to an affordability restriction that is expiring, any other criteria that they can establish, and has one open hazardous violation, okay, or any other criteria that the department seems to establish. As you continue down, it gives a bunch more definition. The department shall provide notice to owners of properties. They need to establish a manner of, if you do get that notice, how and where you're going to be, you can appeal that notice. So, right, that's a process that has to be established. The actual notice needs to be established and written. Those are things that the commissioner has to determine and lay out a process for, that hire the analyst, identifying entities that are qualified. So nonprofits are going to have to register. There's kind of going to be like a marketplace that's established where you can register or apply for qualification. I know you have to be an established or an experienced landlord, I guess, or have someone on your staff as far as management company. I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of those entities getting created this year, with people seeing an opportunity to control housing in the city, because there's nothing about the nonprofits selling the property afterwards, right? So like I wonder if people are going to buy these, we're going to establish nonprofits who are then going to get funding from the city to rehab these properties and then go sell the properties, then close like the nonprofit. I mean, like, this is a huge opportunity for fraud, a huge opportunity for embezzlement that the city just created for no reason. That's unfortunate. And then towards the end of the law, it does go over instances where the property is not covered under this law. Transfers of these kinds can happen without penalty. So these are not subject to the provisions of this chapter. Owners or a purchaser who refinances a covered property, so you can freely refinance your building. Transfer real property affected by the government implementing like eminent domain. So that's not going to be covered by this property. The city could just take your property and not have to offer it to a nonprofit, but you can't transfer it. That's what that is saying. The transfer of an economic interest therein made under a deed in lieu of foreclosure or related agreement related to repayment of a loan in order of avoidance of foreclosures. So I believe this is the property going to the bank. To any transfer of real property or economic interest therein held by a government body. So again, the city does not have to follow the laws that they're imposing on their private citizens. To any transfer of real interest of a property by device or intestate. So if property is left in a will, if property is being put in a family trust, if the property is going to your heirs legally in the state of New York, it's not going to be covered. So you can pass these investment properties down to your kids without having to sell them. That's what this is saying. Any transfer of interest in property between or among spouses, domestic partners, siblings, but not limited to half siblings, step siblings, and adoptive siblings, and parents. So your immediate family, you can transfer property to. And it even says here, not limited to step parents or adoptive parents or guardians and their children, grandparents and their grandchildren, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, great aunts, great uncles, grandnieces, grandnephews, first or second cousins, or any combination thereof. So you can transfer and sell to, at least your one's first removed family. To a transaction, the sole purpose of which is to secure debt or obligations that a transact entered into solely for the purpose of returning a security. So these are selling mortgage debts. Those can be allowed. To any transfer of real property or an economic interest therein from a mere agent, dummy, straw man, or conduit to his principal, or from the principal to his agent, dummy, straw man, or conduit. So I believe, if I understand this correctly, this is transferring from an LLC to the person that owns the LLC, right? So there's like a deed is usually used to convey that transfer. If I own a property in an LLC and I'm going to put it in another one, or put it in my own name, or vice versa, okay, like a deed needs to be generated. It looks like a sale for no money. That is still going to be allowed. Another line back here on like page 9, immediately following the transfer of recovered property is for a term not less than 15 years and is subject to existing or new extended low-income housing commitment or a comparable regulatory agreement as a result of the federal, state, or city program with occupancy, rent, and income requirements at least as restrictive as under Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code. So once a property does make this transfer to a nonprofit, they are going to keep it as a low-income property for up to 15 years, for at least 15 years. So there's a few other pages that go through like IRS taxes, things like that. I don't want to give you that advice. I would highly suggest that you speak to your attorney or speak to your CPA to go over any potential impacts that this may have for you. And at the bottom of the bill, page like 12 and 13, it does go through other instances where somebody will not be covered in this. But my big takeaway here is that small landlords are going to be hurt immensely. People who are getting into their elderly age that have owned buildings for 20 years, they may be low income, they bought property with 421A tax abatements, and those were expiring in 30 years, and like those 30 years are coming up. A lot of these were built in the early 90s into the early 2000s. So there's a lot of investments that are on right now that people were planning on cashing in on, that this is going to make it much more difficult, and will probably wind up with them losing value and equity in their projects. And that's really unfortunate for them. It's also just adding a big paperwork, bureaucratic mess, more to the court system, definitely things that were unnecessary. So the city could have just funded the rehab of low-income housing, of rent-stabilized housing, with a promise to keep it, affordable from the private owners. But again, like, they're not going to fund private owners because that's going to look bad for them, and they are just trying to platform on this to use to get votes from low-income voters. Those are the people that turn out in droves because there's a lot more of that than there is private owners in New York City. So I'll do it for this video on COPA. I'll certainly keep you guys up to date with any future updates on it. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think about this. If you are excited for it, not excited for it, what you're doing about it. A lot of people are looking to trade their property the next year before this comes into fruition. But then again, some of the people that are looking to buy at a discount because they know that's the case. So we'll see how the investment sales market in New York City, what that looks like this year. All right, thanks, peace, see you soon.